Hello friends, Jermaine here, and I am back. I've been away for quite a bit of time, probably 3 to 4 weeks. But also during my time away, I also spent a week or so working on my blog. So right here is the Creative Bracket blog, and this blog specifically has got tutorials on Dart, on the Dart language itself and tools. So do check it out. You can visit it at creativebracket.com, or you could also visit it at creativebracket.dev. That will also bring you here. If you haven't got your .dev domain, be quick and secure yours. Okay, so in this video, we'll be looking at the Highlight.js framework, and we'll be looking specifically how we can interoperate with this JavaScript library from Dart. I'm sure everyone knows what Highlight.js is, but if not, as it says here, it provides syntax highlighting for the web. So this is an example with the Swift language. So we'll be going through the usage documentation, and we'll be following these examples in Dart. So yeah, hopefully this will be an interesting video, especially when we get to the bit with WebWorkers. All right, so let's begin. If you haven't already, download the Dart extension for Visual Studio Code. And what this extension does is essentially allows the Dart language support, and it allows a debugger for Visual Studio Code. But also specifically, what the author has done in this latest update is to allow you to bootstrap Dart projects using the stagehand tool. So it integrates stagehand into this package. So the way we'll use it is if we bring up the commands and then we select, we'll see this new command here, Dart new project, once this extension is installed. So we just select that, and then it says fetching stagehand templates, and then we want to generate a bare bones web app. So I'll click that, and then we'll enter a name, which is Highlight, for Highlight.js. So when I hit enter, tell me to select a folder to create a project in, and then I'll select that folder. What it does, it goes on ahead and it creates that folder, and it generates the project, files and folders, and then we just need to run the pub-get command to install our packages. But before that, we need to add the JS dependency here, and I think it's not .6.0. And once I save as well, the Dart extension detects that we've saved this file, and it goes ahead and grabs our packages for us. Whilst our packages are installing, we need to grab a copy. Essentially, we need to grab the links to our Highlight.js scripts. So we'll grab the minified JavaScript, and we'll plant that in here. And we also need to grab the minified CSS. So we'll grab default min CSS, and I'll place that here. Okay, so now that's done, let's launch this now. So we do web dev serve, and we enable live reload. Reload. Okay, so now it's ready on localhost 8080. So after we've confirmed that our app is running on the localhost, we now need to create our interop file. So to do that, I'll start by creating a couple of folders. So we'll create a lib folder. In our lib folder, we'll create a source folder, which is in line with Dart conventions for laying out our project. And in our source file, I'll create an interop.dart file here. And then just under the lib folder, we'll create a file called highlight.dart. which is usually after the name of our project, which I just called it Highlight. So in Highlight.dart, we will export essentially what we have in our source. So source interop.dart. All right, so let's come back to our interop file, and we'll start by using the JS annotation, which comes as part of the JS package. And we need to give this file a library name, which we'll call it Highlight interop. And to get rid of the red squiggly lines, we need to import our JS package. So there we go. So now the first thing we need to do is to define a hook essentially into our Highlight.js. So it's external because it's outside the Dart space, and it will be an external getter for the name of the namespace, which is HL.js. And then we need to essentially describe the interface of HL.js to our interop package. So we do that by defining an interface called, just call it Highlight interface, and we need to create it now. So define a class called Highlight interface, and then in here we need to define the methods that we're going to be invoking. So if I go back to the docs, I'm going to start with this one. Document add event listener, DOM content loaded, and so on and so forth. And then it loops over my pre-code tags, and then for each block it invokes this method, highlight block. Okay, so before we get to that though, let's start by defining this method. So external, and then the name of the method is highlight block. Highlight block without the get. Then I believe it's a capital B, and then it takes in an element describing our block. But in order to use this element annotation, this element type, you need to import the Dart HTML library, which contains this type. Okay, so I'll save this, and we're not going to expect anything yet because we need to use it. And before we do that, let's put in some code in here, some pre-code tags in here. So pre-code tags, and I'm just going to speed this one up. Okay, so I got two examples here with JavaScript code and with HTML code. And of course, this is happening because in our main.dart, the code that was generated replaces the output div. So let's get rid of this. And so that solves that. And then to get rid of the centering, we'll come to styles, file, and we'll get rid of this styling here. So it should look like that. Okay, so let's import our interop file and use it. So at the moment we're gonna test this method out. We're gonna import our interop, or essentially import highlight.dart, because highlight.dart exports that file anyway. So in here, we'll be able to do query selector all, and then we want to query select our output, our pre-code tags, and then for each of those, we want to call Highlight.js highlight block, and then we'll pass our block in. So let's save this and try it. See what happens. Okay, there we go. So we got this working straight away. Let's come back here and see what other examples we have. So we've done this one. And then it says you can use any tags, any other tags to mark up our code. So if we don't use a container that preserves line breaks, we can essentially, we can configure Highlight.js, use a breaker tag. Okay, so let's try this one then. So let's come back here, I'll come to my index file, and let's copy this one, and instead we'll place this in a div with a class of code. We just rendered this here, and then we need to create a definition for configure, which takes in these options. So we'll do that by defining external, and then void, and then configure, and then configure would essentially take in some config options. I'll call it HL config options, and then it'll take in our options object. Okay, so now we need to define our HL config options. Since this is a generic JavaScript object, we need to use the JS annotation, and we need to mark it with the anonymous annotation as well. And now we'll create our class for HL config options, and then we'll create an external factory. So essentially this is a factory constructor, and then this constructor will take in a couple of named parameters. So one of them is type boolean, and it's use br. And then our instance property would be external as well. Returns void would be a setter for use br, which expects a boolean. So just call it use br val, doesn't matter what I call it. Okay, so let's save this, and then what we'll do in main.dart is, so we're gonna call the configure method on here, and then we'll define our config options, and then we define use br, and we set that to true. And then I'm going to query select our div with a class of code, essentially for, well, I'm not going to do a for each. I can simply just do HLJS.highlight block, and then we'll query select our div with the class of code. So let's save this and see what we get. Okay, that seems to be working. Let me just inspect this a bit. Yeah, so it's working. It's wrapped it up for us. Okay, so HTML formatting on save is enabled in VS Code, which is why whenever I save this file, the formatting, well, it's automatically formatted. So I am going to undo that briefly. Okay, so let's disable format on save. You may not need to do the same for workspace settings, I think. Yeah, so let's disable format on save, and then let's try this again. Okay, so I did some further digging to this issue with the breaker tags, and I came upon this issue. If you go to the Highlight.js repo, and so what Ivan is saying is what use BR actually means is that the original sources use BR for line breaks instead of the other line break symbol, and they should be retained. So that means we essentially have to put the line breaks in our HTML manually for it to work. So that's one part of it. And then the next part is, well, let's do this one first. So I'll put the breaker tag here. And then if I save this, it should improve our formatting. Okay. And also the other bit I noticed is with the indentation. So if I put more spaces here, you can see that it doesn't affect it that much, which is because if you come back here, someone experienced the same issue, and then the recommendation from Ivan is to use CSS as a means of solving it. So white space, set it to pre. So let's do that now. I'll come to our CSS file, and then I'll do div code white space pre. And yeah, that seems to improve things a bit. So perhaps I can do that, get rid of the breaker tag, and if I save that, that should format it the way I want. Yeah, that's it, pretty much. Okay, if we go back to the documentation, usage examples, now that brings us to WebWorkers. We'll query select our code block, and then we'll create a new worker with an onMessage event, and then we'll essentially push the contents of this code block to our worker. And then in our worker, it's importing Highlight.js, and then it's invoking the Highlight auto method, and it's able to access the Highlight.js namespace through the self keyword, which is a reference to the context within the worker, and then it posts the value from the result. So let's see how we'll do that. So if I come back here, I'll start by copying this, and I'll paste it outside of the output.div, and in fact I'll give this a class of from worker, and I'll add a comment block here, in fact, on web worker, so we know. Okay, and then if I come to main.dart, because this is bound to output the output div, I don't need to do anything with that one. So I will come over here afterwards, and then what we're gonna do is we're going to select our code from worker, and then we'll create a new web worker. So we need to create a new worker object. Then we create a new web worker, and then we need to define what our worker is, which we haven't created yet. But essentially it will be worker.dart.js, and we'll get to that in a bit. But for now, let's assume that exists, and then we do worker.onMessage, and then we want to listen for essentially any message events. So it's of type message event, then our event, and then what we're going to do is set the inner HTML of our code element to the data from our message event. And then what we want to do is essentially to post the contents of our code tag to our worker. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to create this file, essentially our worker.dart file, and we'll do that in the same folder as our main.dart file. So I'm going to create a new file, and then I'll call it worker.dart. And in our worker.dart, I'm going to do a couple of things. We need to import the Dart HTML library for browser-based development, and then we're going to import our interop file, and then after those two we need to define a main function. Essentially that's where our app bootstrapping logic would go in. So in our main function we need to create what's known as a dedicated worker global scope. So this object, that is because dedicated worker global scope is essentially the object that contains the context for our web worker, so which is the self keyword. So if we come back to the highlight documentation example, in our worker we're using the self keyword here to reference the context in there. So that's how we're able to retrieve it, by creating an instance of this class, and then we get access to that. So let's do that. So call it DWS, and then we'll create a new dedicated worker global scope object. In fact, it doesn't have a constructor, so what we need is the instance. What we need is an instance of dedicated worker global scope. Okay, and then afterwards we can just print a message to the console just to know that our web worker is running. So worker running, and then what we need to do is we need to import the Highlight.js script, which is in, if we come back to our index.html file, this is our script. So import that into our worker.dart file, then wrap that in a string, and then we need to retrieve our Highlight.js namespace. So in order to do that, we'll use a library in the JS package called JSUtil, and that contains a top level function called getProperty, and then getProperty will pass it the object, so which is dws.self, which is our context, and then we want to retrieve the HLJS property in there. So by default, the type this returns is of type dynamic, so it returns the dynamic type. But then what we want is the highlight interface type that we defined in there, which means that we can now listen for data sent to our worker. So message event, and then we are able to do HL.js dot highlight block. Let's go back to the docs. What is it doing? Highlight auto. Okay, so it's not highlight block. So it does highlight auto, and then in our results there's a value property in there. So we need to create a definition for this method essentially. So let's go back and comment this out now, and then I'll come back to our interop file here, and then we'll define a method for highlight auto. So use the external keyword, and then it's highlight auto, which takes in a string, and I'll just call it snippet, and then this highlight auto interface returns an object containing a value property. So we need to define an interface for this, so I'll just call it highlight auto result. Let's call it highlight auto interface, and then let's define this interface here, and in there it's got a value, like that. So if I save this and then come back to our worker.dart file, I can call the highlight auto method, and then we need to pass in the data from our message event. And once that's done, we need to set this to the correct interface as well. So highlight auto interface, and then once that's done, we can then do dws dot post message, which will be the value from our result. So that should be it from this standpoint. But then we need to do one more thing, because if you notice, our WebWorkers isn't working, which is because when running a web project by default, main.dart is seen as the main point of entry to our Dart web project. So what we need to do is essentially to tell Dart about worker.dart, and we need to create a separate output for worker.dart, because it's treated as a separate file, given that it's got our web worker stuff happening in there. So if we look at our pubspec.yaml, you find that we're using the build web compilers package, which is what we use for developing web-based projects. So if we come to the documentation for that on their GitHub page, what we need to do is essentially we need to configure a build target, and in our build target essentially we need to tell the build web compilers to generate different entry points for all the Dart files in our web directory. So all I need to do is to copy this, come here, and then create a build.yaml file here and paste this in here. So I'll save this, which now means that our essentially it will terminate, our build gets terminated because it's recognized that we have a build.yaml file here. So what we need to do is to run our live reload server again, ensure that both files are saved. Okay, and we have an issue here, which is, well, it tells us only external JS interop functions are supported. Try removing external keyword or annotating the function with it as a JS interop function. So all we need to do is, if we come back to interop, we can annotate these with the JS interop annotation, and in fact we can use anonymous as well. So if I save that, yeah, that should do. And let's reload our page. Okay, so we got a response, worker running, and we reload again. Okay, worker running, and then there we go. That's it there. It's formatted. We can make sure that worked by inspecting the markup, and yeah, we can see that it's added the various span tags and so on and so forth. Okay, so this brings us to the end of this video. I hope you found this video informative and that you learned something different today. If you really enjoyed it, do hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, do hit the subscribe button, and also hit the bell notification icon next to that subscribe button so that you are notified when new content is released. Of course, if you got any feedback, if you got any comments, let me know down below. Thank you.